But I'm delighted to be here to kick off the events looking at the various options that would be available to the UK if we left the European Union. And I will, of course, touch on the WTO option, the World Trade Organized option, and I will briefly touch on the Turkish option, but I'll also talk about free trade agreements more generally. Right, well, let's start right at the beginning. What happens if the UK leaves the EU? Well, the first thing to say is that the default position would be that we would be under the WTO option, the World Trade Organization option. The UK would resume the full rights and responsibilities under the various WTO arrangements concerning trade and tariffs. We would not be isolated, we would not be bobbing in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean like Rockall. We would actually be well linked in to a trading framework. I think the second thing is that you'd say about the WTO option is, of course, when it comes to trade with the EU, we would be facing the common external tariff from the European Union. But then you have to ask yourself, what sort of deal is that? I looked at a House of Commons library paper, and it suggested that the weighted average now for the EU external tariffs is 1%. It's fallen dramatically through the years. And don't forget of our exports of goods and services. Actually, services are now 40% of our total exports, and they don't attract tariffs at all. So you can see that perhaps the common external tariff is not such a big deal after all. But of course, there is one thing to remember, that some products, not least of all cars, and cars are now a very important part of our export trade, they would attract, if there were no trade agreements with the EU, they would attract a tariff of about nearly 10%. So one has to keep that in mind. I think the third thing I would like to say is that it's not just us as the UK that would be under the WTO option. A lot of international trade would be as well. I went onto the OECD website. I've been travelling the websites, as you can gather, for this particular talk. And the OECD calculated that about half of all international trade is under trade agreements, whether they're free trade agreements or customs unions or whatever. And of course, the difference between a free trade agreement and a customs union is that in free trade, no internal tariffs, but the countries decide their own external tariffs. In a customs union, no internal tariffs, but of course you have a common external tariff. So the OECD calculated about half were under these trade agreements. Now, this is where it's useful being a mathematician, because I calculated that about half are not. And indeed, about half of them are under the WTO. That is not trivial. It's not a one-off. It's not something that's unknown. I mean, it just isn't like that. And I think the fourth point I'd like to make about the WTO option is that a lot of the countries that are covered by the WTO option actually are trading extraordinarily successfully. You do not need actually to be in a free trade area, or you do not need to be in the European Union in order to be able to trade. And in fact, more important for importers is not so much where the product is coming from, but the general availability and the quality and the price of the product. And as far as exporters are concerned, again, it's not necessarily where you're actually exporting to, but whether there are buoyant, growing markets, or whether you're dealing with sluggish, non-growing markets or mature markets like the EU. No, exporters are concerned with markets that grow, because that's what it's all about. And if I give you some numbers about UK trade with China, and of course China at the moment has no free trade agreement with the EU, it is actually quite interesting to look at them. Taking the decade 2003 to 2013, UK imports from China rose nearly fourfold. UK imports from the EU, within the EU, with all the advantages of being in the single market, etc., 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 they were just up 50%. And when you look at the exports, then our exports to China over that decade rose fivefold, whereas again, our exports to the EU rose by under 50%. In other words, when you're actually dealing with trade, you're dealing with economic issues, you're dealing with commercial reality. You're not necessarily talking about whether countries are in the EU or they're not in the EU. And I think just as a final little point about that, let's just remember that when you look at the share of UK trade going to the EU, it is in secular decline. Whatever the advantages of membership, the share is in secular decline. 10 years ago, it was about 55%. It's now 45%. And no doubt, in 10 years' time, it'll be 35%. Who knows? I've got a ruler, I can do that. That's called, I'm very technical, by the way, I should just point that out. So that's the WTO. We will not be floating in the middle of nowhere. We will be locked into a trading system that actually is successful. I think, just to dismiss the Turkish option super quickly, if you're in the Turkish option, it means you're in the customs union. And, of course, I've just been saying now that the Commonwealth external tariff, except for certain types of products like cars, is trivial. You can forget about it. So there's no great advantage of that. But there is, to me, one big disadvantage of being in a customs union, and that is, of course, the EU negotiates the free trade agreements for you. You cannot do it yourself. Now, of course, some people may regard that as a good thing. You know, there are more pluses than minuses of having the EU negotiate your trade deals. I personally think that the minuses way outweigh the pluses. I think we should be able to negotiate our own trade agreements. So having said all that, I'd now like to move on to some more general comments. I've just said that outside the EU, outside the customs union, we'd be able to negotiate our own trade agreements. And I think this is where Britain would go. I'm pretty well sure that it would. Of course, nobody can be certain, but I'm pretty sure it would. And we'd have substantial negotiating clout. After all, this is a rich, prosperous, large market for a lot of the exporters of the world, and for a lot of the countries of the world, we've actually got a trade deficit with them. These people are not wanting, they will not want to stop trading with us. They will not want a disruption to their trade with us. They will be perfectly happy to sit down and think about negotiating trade deals with us. It's in their interest. It's never mind about our interests. It's in their interests. And this notion that we will be too small or too pathetic to negotiate our own trade deals, I just found weird. I think the first trade deal with China was done by Iceland. Now, rumour has it that Iceland is a smaller country than Britain, but, you know, don't take my word for it. However, I think there are three different groups of countries that we would consider opening trade agreements with. Of course, the first is the European Union. And apropos the discussion, the comment I made about the external tariff on cars, it's probably no bad thing. And here, I do think we'd have the most amazing negotiating clout with them. Suffice to say that when people talk about, oh, they wouldn't trade with us, oh, they would lock us out of the market, oh, they'd punish us because we'd left the EU, oh, come on, please. Just look at look at the trade figures, look at the facts. I think last year that we had a visible trade deficit of £120 billion. These are figures hot off the press from the Office of National Statistics. 30 billion of that was with Germany. 2% of UK GDP was actually the trade deficit in goods with Germany. I have a shrewd suspicion that a lot of German exporters, not least of all in the car industry, would actually wish that trade to continue. And we had trade deficit with Belgium and the Netherlands and France and Italy, and so it goes on. In fact, where we had the big surplus was the United States of America. But again, I think we'd have huge leverage in being able to negotiate this. This would be a win-win situation. This would be to everybody's benefit. I think the second group of countries that the United Kingdom would consider having trade agreements with would be those countries that currently have trade agreements with the EU. Now, if we leave the EU, we will no longer be part of those trade agreements. We'll be excluded from them. I think sometimes people seem to think that we'd still have those agreements, but we wouldn't. And of course, I'm thinking of countries like Korea or Turkey or indeed Mexico. I mean, these are fairly sizable trading countries. Now, I think a lot in the case, again, any Korean exporter wouldn't want to disrupt or damage their trade with us. And so I think they would look at the EU trade agreements and say, we'll take those as templates for a UK-Korean trade agreement, for example. I think that's perfectly plausible. I think it, again, would all make sense for all of us. And then the third group of countries would be what I call countries that really have been slightly left out in the cold by the EU. Or some of them have started negotiations and they're sort of at varying degrees of maturity. And of course, I'm thinking particularly of countries like the Commonwealth. and the United States of America, where we have a big trade surplus, as I just said. But I've always felt the Commonwealth countries have been desperately, desperately ignored by this country, as if they're some relic of empire and something we should consign to the history books. But in fact, if you look at the Commonwealth now, it is, if you consider it as an economic bloc, it is thriving, it is growing, and it will be a growing market in the future. There's absolutely no question about this. And so what I would do is my third group of countries to have free trade agreements with, I'd perhaps look at whatever the EU has managed to negotiate so far with Canada, and it's got somewhere with Canada, although the trade agreement is not yet operative, and you could use that as some template for looking at a UK-Canadian trade agreement. I'd look at what they've tried to do with Singapore, which I think has been initialed after many, many years, but is not yet operative. They've started negotiations in a half-hearted fashion, as far as I can see, with India or Malaysia. Again, I think we could work on whatever negotiations they've got there and push them forward. And I suspect it'd be far easier to get these trade agreements agreed between the two countries of the UK and, for example, I don't know, Malaysia, than it is for the EU 28 than to agree with, say, Malaysia. And similarly, I think with the United States of America, of course, we know the saga of TTIP. I mean, goodness knows where that'll end up. But I would have thought, quite honestly, that if you just had a US-UK trade agreement, that would be far easier to push through, and you don't have to consider all the sensitivities of the various different EU members. I think the prospects of trade agreements under those circumstances are extremely, extremely bright. And of course, dear old Australia and New Zealand, countries for which I have a soft spot, there is no attempt to negotiate any trade deal with them at all. And then outside the Commonwealth, outside the States, you've got important countries like China and Japan, and indeed the Gulf Cooperation Council, where we do a lot of trade with Saudi Arabia and other parts of the Gulf, where I would seriously consider that the Britain should look to developing trade agreements. So that is, time is running out fast, Mr. Chairman. But I will say two very quick things before I sort of pack up and leave it to my esteemed colleagues to develop these ideas. One is the prospect of joining EFTA, and the other is the prospect of joining the EEA. And I know these things are going to be discussed further out. On EFTA, I think there's every good reason to try and rejoin EFTA. We left, of course, when we joined the EEC back in 1973. And as I understand it, to get back into EFTA, we'd obviously need the agreement of the EFTA countries, which I would hope would be forthcoming. But it wouldn't just be able to have free trade with those particular countries, but particularly Norway and Switzerland are really quite important markets of ours. But under certain circumstances, providing the third countries agree to them, we would then have access to the EFTA agreements. And if anybody thinks that EFTA hasn't been busy negotiating trade agreements, I do recommend that you go on the WTO website. And there you will see an extensive list of EFTA agreements that have been negotiated. I mean, if EFTA can do it, why can't the EU do it? Well, there we go. Leave that on one side. So I think there's a lot to be said for joining EFTA, rejoining EFTA, if I may say so. But I will finish, because time is flying by, on less positive remarks about the EEA, which is the European Economic Area, which comprises, of course, the 28 EU countries and 3 EFTA countries, not Switzerland, but it does include Iceland and Norway and Liechtenstein. I always think it's beneficial to be a stamp collector because at least you know where Liechtenstein is. But joking apart, if we left the EU, we would leave the EEA. There is this sort of belief that somehow we could stay in it and make the best of it. But no, we would be leaving because we joined the EEA as part of the EU. You leave the EU, you leave the EEA. And if you wanted to rejoin the EEA, you would have to get agreement with all the 3 EFTA countries that belong to the EEA, all the EU 28 countries and the EU itself. But apart from all that, would it be a good idea? Well, of course, you would have access to this thing called the single market and the 4 freedoms. But against all that, you would have to bear all the costs of the regulations within the single market, that I do believe the costs of which outweigh the benefits, and I'd be highly reluctant to take those regulations on. And it's not just the regulations that already exist, it's the regulations in the future which you have no control over at all, and I just don't think that would be a sensible option to sign up to. But on that rather negative view, I suppose I ought to give up, Tim. But I'd just like to say that I would see a very, very positive future for Britain, even if you were just in the WTO option. But I am convinced, given Britain's size and importance as an economic player in the world scene, that it would be in a very, very good position to negotiate some very helpful, mutually beneficial trade agreements with some of our great partner countries. I have little doubt that that would happen. So, a bright future.